I said last week that we were going to be talking about how to get started in the Bible study. We've been preparing. How do you prepare to get started? Now, how do you actually start the study? The first step in studying the Bible is to read the Bible. I recommend formal equivalence Bibles. We talked about this before. ESV, New American Standard, New King James, those are all good. But honestly, if you're not really familiar with the Bible, a dynamic equivalent Bible is fine. Just for your first time through, it's easier to read. You won't get bogged down in weird sentence structures. So a dynamic equivalence Bible like an NIV or Complete Jewish Bible, TLV, New Revised Standard, there's an endless list of them. That's fine for your first read through the Bible. If you've been through it a few times, I'm not really sure there's any point in a dynamic equivalence Bible at that point. If you're really engaging in study, you need a formal equivalence translation, and you need to reread it occasionally. Some people reread the Bible every year. I have an audio Bible. I try to go through that once a year, and audio Bibles are fine. And I think it's best to vary your input. Sometimes read it, sometimes listen to it, because your brain uses different pathways when you're getting different kinds of input. When you're reading something, decoding the letters and words through your eyes versus when you're hearing it, your brain processes it differently. And so you're going to pick up on different things, and it's going to be writing memories in different ways. So I encourage you to maybe read it one time and then listen to it another time. The next thing is to read the whole book. What book are you studying? After you've read through the whole Bible, ideally, you'd go back to Genesis and study Genesis. But I know that there's so much in the Bible, and it's hard to say what's the most important. If you had 1,000 years to live, I would say, yeah, definitely go back to Genesis. Start studying Genesis, learn that, then go to Exodus, Leviticus, etc. Well, we don't all have 1,000 years to live. So sometimes it's worth focusing on something that's important, that seems more important. Like you've got a critical question you need answered. Well, maybe find the book that talks about that and study that book. I wouldn't focus on the passage until you've studied the book. So after you've read the whole Bible, now you're going to study a book. So read that book. Next, survey the book. And we'll talk a little bit more about what this means here in a minute. But basically kind of get an idea of, the characteristics of the book, what kind of literature it is, who wrote it, that kind of thing. Then look for themes. What's he talking about? Are there patterns in here? Find out about the author and the recipient. Who wrote this book and who do they write it to? This is a really important step in understanding what's happening in the book. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail here in a minute too. So reading the whole Bible and reading the whole book, those are pretty self-explanatory. Just read it. Reading the Bible, you're not trying to understand everything in it your first time through. You're just getting an idea of what the story is. And reading the whole book, once again, you're not really trying to understand everything right now. You're just trying to get a better idea of what this book is about before you really dig in. So let's go to step number 3, survey the book. First question you're going to ask is what kind of literature this is. And this is going to affect how you understand and how you interpret the book. Is this poetry? Is it history? Is it personal correspondence? Is it law? Depending on what kind of literature it is, you're going to read it in a very different way. If it's poetry, well, poetry, especially the Psalms, can have prophecy and lots of deep meaning there, but it's rarely meant to be understood in a very literal manner. David or all the psalmists, they're using very poetic language, lots of hyperbole and flowery speech. And, David says that I can't find anybody who loves God. Everybody hates him. Nobody understands anything. Well, he's being hyperbolic. Paul used this to talk about how we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and that's true. Everybody has sinned. But it's not really true that nobody is searching for God. Nobody in the world is trying to find him. Everybody hates God. That's not really true. It was an emotional outburst. So that's how you read poetry. You understand that he's using a lot of metaphor, a lot of symbolism, a lot of emotion that isn't really meant to be taken in a hyper literal sense. So that would be different from history. If you're reading a history, then you know that this is meant to be taken just for what it is. The person who wrote this is trying to tell us what happened. Sometimes they're adding things about the meaning and trying to draw out other profound ideas. And this is certainly more true in the ancient world than it is today, where histories today they tend to be factual, or at least they present themselves that way. They're trying to tell you who did what to whom when. Whereas in the ancient world, and especially in the Bible, a history tells you who did what to whom and when, but it also tells you why this is important. He did this so that we would know this other thing. He said this way so that we would also get this other idea. And sometimes a historian can add allusions and references to other things that we're supposed to understand. One of the ways that the Hebrew writers do this is they will quote one small passage of another book. Maybe they'll just quote like one line out of one of the prophets. Well, we're supposed to understand that when he's quoting this one line, he's probably not meaning for us to think about this one line. He probably wants us to think about the whole prophecy where this line is found. It's a very common thing among Jewish writers and speakers in the ancient world. Well, they will quote one line from something, and you're supposed to think about the whole thing. Law is another one that's a little more literal, obviously more literal than poetry. And it usually means exactly what it says when it says, you will do this, you will not do that. It means exactly that. But sometimes there are things written between the lines that you don't know if you're taking little bits and pieces out. So the commandments may be ordered in a certain way because one thing leads to another. There's a passage that talks about when you go to war and a soldier decides he wants to take this woman home with him. Well, he can do that, but he has to follow these rules. But then the next law starts talking about, well, now if a man has this problem in his house, here's how you deal with it. And then if a man has a rebellious son in his house, here's how you deal with it. And these laws are ordered in this way because one of them leads to the next. You bring the wrong woman into your home, she causes problems, and then this cascades down into your children. And we see this in the life of Judah in Genesis, when he marries a Canaanite woman, his sons become problems, and God actually kills two of them because they are wicked men. And that creates even more problems for Judah. So even in the law, it's not like a code book that we have today where absolutely everything is spelled out. Everything in Scripture is designed to not waste space. They try to maximize their use of words because writing words was expensive. Prophecy is very much like poetry, where there can be a lot of symbolism. And, a prophecy can talk about trees and animals when it's really talking about people or nations. So you have to watch out for that kind of thing. Sometimes it's literal, sometimes it's using metaphor. Prophecy almost always uses metaphor. And apocalyptic literature, this gets even more so, where everything is cryptic and there's lots of doom and gloom, talking about the coming of the day of the Lord and dragons and chimeric monsters and, all kinds of things like this. So there's a lot of symbolism and metaphor built into those. And you have to understand how the people of that day understood those symbols if you're going to understand that book. Not what does it mean to people today? What did it mean to the people when that book was written? So depending on what kind of literature you're reading, you're going to be interpreting it in a different way. Which brings me to the next point. Who wrote to whom? If you know that the person who wrote a book was a shepherd, or he was a king, or this person was a beggar, this is going to change how you read what this person has to say. It's going to change how you think of this person's perspective. So knowing who wrote a book is an important part of understanding it. And who did they write it to? If a beggar writes a letter to a king, that's going to have a different tone than if the king is writing a letter to a beggar. Even if they use the exact same words, it's going to change how you interpret this based on who wrote it to whom. So that's another thing that you need to find out. Why was it written? Was this book written to give somebody advice, to teach a son how to live a better life? Is it a compilation of songs, or was it written so that somebody would understand who Yeshua was? There are books in the Bible that match all of those descriptions, and understanding why the author wrote it can be important to interpreting it. Sometimes a book will tell you why it was written, sometimes not. You might have to read between the lines sometimes. When and where was the written? This is similar to who wrote it and to whom. If you know when and where, that's going to change some things about it. If something was written during the height of the Roman Empire, some metaphors and some things that somebody says is going to be different than if it was written at the height of David's empire. There are going to be some very different ideas expressed. So that's just another thing to keep in mind, and it can also make a difference where the recipients of the letter live. And I'm talking about a letter there, obviously. I'm talking about something like Paul or the apostolic letters. Yeah, so if you know that Paul, who was raised as a Jew, was an expert in the Jewish law, he's writing to people who barely even know what a Jew is, and they certainly don't know God's law. And then he starts talking about the law, or he starts talking about the law that they used to keep. Well, if he didn't specify what law that is, and he just says, this law that you used to keep, well, if you know who he's writing to, you'll have a better idea of what law he's talking about. Now, and specifically on this one, I'm talking about the Galatians. When he writes the letter to the Galatians, he says, why are you going back to these elemental principles of the world? Well, this isn't God's commandments. They can't go back to God's commandments because they never kept them in the first place. So he's talking about man-made laws. And that's something you wouldn't know if you don't know who is writing it to whom. Okay, next one, tone and style. What tone is the author taking? Does it sound like he's mad about something? Is he, telling people off? And this comes across in the book of Galatians again, where he's saying, who has bewitched you, you foolish Galatians? So clearly Paul is upset about something that they're doing, that they've gotten really wrong. In other places, like when he writes to the Romans, he says, everybody knows what a great job you guys are doing and how faithful you are. That's a very different tone in his writing. And that's going to make a difference in how you interpret that book. Then next part, we're going to look for themes. And obviously, there's a lot of overlap between some of these points. So look for people, places, and events. Now, this will be related, like especially in the letters. This is going to be, the person who wrote it and the person receiving it. Those are some of the people. But they're also going to mention other people. Almost all of Paul's letters mention other people. So are these people important to whatever is being written about? The places. In the book of Joshua, there are a lot of place names. This is where a good Bible atlas will come in handy. Knowing the route that people are taking, the events that are describing. If these things take any kind of prominent role in the book, well, they're going to be important. Obviously, if you're reading the Gospels, Yeshua and his disciples are going to take very prominent roles. In the book of John, Nicodemus actually takes a prominent role for several chapters, even though his name is only mentioned briefly. Places. Obviously we mentioned the book of Romans, book of Galatians. Places are important there because the place has a really big impact on how you interpret the book, how you understand, or how you can view how the recipients would have understood this book. If places are mentioned, Paul mentions Cenchrea and some other cities in the book of Romans. Well, that's important. It's not vital to understanding the book of Romans itself, but it could be depending on how it was discussed. In the Gospels, it's important to understand that most of the Gospels are taking place in the Promised Land, in the Roman provinces of the Galilee and Samaria and Judea, in the Decapolis. That's going to affect how you interpret some of the things that are going on. Repeated words or phrases. When you're reading a book, you want to watch for anything that's being repeated, because these things are important to the author. It's important to whatever point he's trying to get across. Some of Paul's letters, he focuses on things like works of law or the circumcision. These are phrases or concepts that are important to whatever idea Paul is trying to get across. In the book of John, there's a phrase that John, or a single word that John repeats a lot, and he uses it in a peculiar way. It's the term Jews. John is a Jew, and he's writing about almost exclusively about Jews, but he keeps talking about the Jews as if they were some different people. Well, in the Gospel of John, they are. When John uses the term the Jews, he's almost always talking about the religious leadership, not the Jewish people. So when he says the Jews wanted to kill Yeshua, he doesn't mean all of the Jews. He means the religious leaders, the priests and the Sadducees and the scribes, mostly, sometimes the Pharisees too. So you watch for repeated words and phrases, and this will help you get a good idea of what the author is going to be talking about. And it may not tell you everything he's going to say about that topic, but you're going to get an idea that this idea is important in this book. Now, at this stage, you're not trying to understand everything in the book. You're just trying to get an idea of what's important in the book. So the next one is conflict. Are there any specific conflicts that are talked about? In the book of Galatians, you've got, there are some people who are wanting to force the Galatian converts to become circumcised. And this takes a primary spot in Paul's point, what he's trying to tell the Galatians. In the book of Romans, there's a conflict between Jewish believers and Gentile believers. And it's not a severe conflict, but it's the reason that he's writing the book. So you want to watch for these conflicts. In the gospel, there are repeated confrontations between Yeshua and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So these are going to be important to understanding what's going on. Next, references. And what I mean by references is the author referencing something outside of this book. Sometimes you won't know. The author can quote something and you won't know that he's quoting anything because, they're just saving space, or he expects his readers to understand that this was a quote of something else. Frequently they'll say, as it was written, and then say something. Well, that tells you, for one, it tells you what the author's background is. It tells you that he's familiar with these other works. Paul, for instance, he not only quotes the scriptures, usually the Septuagint, but he also quotes pagan poets. When he's talking to, I don't remember what city it was, maybe at Athens, when he says that, we are all God's children. He was quoting one of the Greek poets. And there's another place where he quotes a Cretan poet. Not sure that Cretan is the correct term there, but he says that I think they were all lazy and crooked people. Not that Paul actually believed that all the people on Crete were lazy and crooked, but one of their own poets said it about them. So this tells you that Paul is not only educated in the Jewish law and scriptures, he's educated in the broader Greek world too. If a book in the Old Testament quotes the law frequently, that will tell you something about where this person is coming from. If he doesn't quote the law, like say the book of Esther, doesn't use the word Yahweh, and doesn't make, as far as I know, doesn't make any references to the law, this tells you something about the author and what they were trying to tell us. And literary devices. If you've taken the chiasm course, you know all about literary devices. I'm kidding. There are a lot of literary devices that are not chiasms. We talked about parallelisms in that course also, but there are metaphor, hyperbole, similes, and metonymies, all of these different kinds of literary devices that can be used. And if an author likes to use a particular kind of device, then you'll know to watch for it. If an author tends to use analogies, like Paul frequently uses analogies, and sometimes he doesn't say that it's an analogy. Well, to start watching for that. And so if he says something that sounds kind of strange, you think, maybe he's using an analogy here. So these are all important things to look for when you're looking for themes in the book. Are there important people, places, or events that are mentioned? Are there repeated words and phrases? Is there a central conflict that the author wants to talk about? Are there references to other books, whether inside or outside of the scriptures? And are there particular literary devices that the author likes to use, and why is he using them? What could he be trying to tell us through these devices? The author and recipient. Kind of talked about this a little bit already, but one of the ways that you can find out about the author of a book is from the Bible itself. Yeshua mentions Moses, talks about the law of Moses, and Moses told you this, and Moses told you that. Well, if you don't know who Moses is, that might be a little confusing. Obviously, if you've been to church for a while, you've heard of Moses, but how much do you really know about him? And when he says Moses told you this, was it really Moses who told you that? Or is he using Moses as a stand-in for the books of Moses, which he also does sometimes? So Paul is another one. Paul writes all these letters, but if you want to know more about Paul, there are other places that the scriptures talk about him. He's mentioned, his life story is told, his ministry story is told in the book of Acts. And we actually get a little glimpse of his life before ministry. We find out that Paul was present at the stoning of Stephen when he was a young man, and he was actually there holding the coats of the people who were throwing the stones. Peter, in his letters, talks a little bit about Paul. Obviously, we have 2 letters of Peter, but we can learn a lot about Peter from the Gospels and the book of Acts. So just using the Bible itself as a way to learn about the author of a book can be very helpful, give you a lot of context. And the same is true of the recipient. Paul writes letters to Timothy and Titus. Well, we can find out a little bit about Timothy and Titus from other places in Scripture, from the book of Acts and from Paul's other letters. John talks about in his letters, we can learn a lot about John from the Gospels, but he addresses one of his letters to the elect lady. Well, who exactly is the elect lady? I mean, that seems a little mysterious, but there are a couple of ways that people can go with that. What ladies were prominent in John's life? Well, when Yeshua was on the cross, he looked at John and said, take care of my mother. Essentially, that's what he's saying. And we have to presume that he was talking to John because it doesn't say that, but the context seems to indicate that that's what it is. But there's another possibility, because in the book of Revelation, John talks about another lady that appears to be Israel. So there are a couple of options on what John may be talking about there. And we wouldn't know that if we didn't know more about John himself. Next, we can find out about the author and the recipient by using the reference tools that we talked about before. Encyclopedias, dictionaries, history books, commentaries, all of these things can help us. The further we get away from scripture, the more subjective things get, and the more we need to hold things at arm's length and not necessarily accept everything they say as fact. But, some tools are more reliable and more authoritative than others. There are other writings inside and outside the Bible that might talk about the people in the Bible. There are actually references to some of the, to Yeshua and other people who wrote the Bible in ancient literature that was not written by Christians. And of course, then you also have the early church fathers, things like that. Biographies are a good source, but these are even more subjective because we really know so little about most of the people who wrote the Bible that writing a biography is a really difficult thing. So authors end up filling in a lot of gaps with assumptions or, using some imagination to try to fill in things that we don't really know. So biographies, I like reading biographies, but I'm not a fan of reading biographies about people in the Bible because I don't necessarily trust the author to get it right. Now, if you find a really good author who does a good job and is objective, could be a good source. And primary sources, this is difficult. Primary sources are not, well, let me define a primary source. Primary source is something written by somebody who had personal knowledge of something else. So if you want to know how the early church believed about a certain idea, well, you'd go to the writings of the early church fathers. They can tell you themselves. This is a primary source. The Gospels are a primary source because they were eyewitnesses to the events. Now, Luke, the Gospel of Luke it kind of is a primary source, kind of isn't. Luke was not an eyewitness, but he interviewed the eyewitnesses and wrote down what they told him. So, and it's contemporary. Luke was alive at the same time Yeshua was. So, that's a pretty strong primary source. Not quite as strong as John or Matthew, who were eyewitnesses to the events themselves. But primary sources outside of the Bible, Jewish writings like the works of Josephus and Philo, Roman historians, Tacitus, the early church fathers. In the early church fathers, of course, are primary sources for their own day. So you could read Polycarp to know something about John because he was a disciple of John. Clement of Rome is another good one. He was a second generation disciple. He knew some of the apostles personally. So he's a good primary source for early Christian theology. A little bit later, you've got guys like Origen and John Chrysostom. I don't trust those quite as much. They're further removed, and they didn't actually know any of the apostles. They had been long dead by the time those guys lived and wrote. So I would no longer consider them primary sources for anything having to do with the writers of the Bible. They are secondary sources at best. And a secondary source is somebody who is writing about information that they got from other people who were writing about something. So if I were to write a biography of Paul, I could use the Bible, which is a primary source because Paul actually wrote part of it. And then I could also use the writings of Josephus and Philo to find out about Jewish culture of the day. And I could use material from the early church fathers. But anything I use from the early church fathers would be a secondary source because they didn't actually know Paul personally. And maybe Clement and some of those or Polycarp, some of those first generation people did. But, after the, kind of once we get into the second century, they're all secondary sources by that time. So primary sources are a really good way to find out about an author and a recipient. Secondary sources are like biographies, encyclopedias, things like that. Those are helpful in getting a broad idea about the person. But all of those tools are useful. And as you're reading these things, you're going to be learning about other writers too. So, if you study the Gospel of Matthew and you've read a biography of Matthew, you've read some encyclopedia articles about the places that Matthew mentions, then when you get to the book of Mark, well, you already have a good base of knowledge about some of the things that Mark is talking about because he's covering the same ground that Matthew did. So it may seem like a lot of work to study a single book of the Bible, but all of the work that you're putting into studying this book is going to help you with everything else. All of this knowledge is cumulative. I mean, you're not going to remember it all, but it's got to be in there somewhere, and it's all going to help you understand it better. Even if you don't remember all the specifics of things that you learned, you're going to have a better idea. The facts that are buried somewhere deep in your mind are still going to be in there, impacting how you read the scriptures after that point. So it is time worth spent understanding who the author and the recipient is and going through all of this work. And before you actually sit down to study this book, whatever book it is, verse by verse, do all this preliminary work. And the book is going to it's going to open up to you in ways that you had not considered before if you haven't done this kind of work.